Top of the morning, Dan and Amy, and the discussion about a response to a predicted second wave of infections in the fall and the winter. Let's start with Dr. Deborah Birx, of course, one of the key medical advisors to the president. Her appearance on This Week yesterday, she said this.
We're trying to understand during this period of coming out of the closure, how do we maintain openness and safety? And I think that's what we're going to be learning through May, June, and July. And also, I want to be very clear to the American people. We are preparing for that potential fall issue, both in PPE, which is protective devices, both in ventilator stockpiles, and ensuring that we're really pushing on therapeutics and vaccine development so we can be ready if the virus does come back in a significant way.
But you don't see the country closing down again?
It's difficult to tell, and I really am data-driven, so I'm collecting data right now about whether governors and whether states and whether communities are able to open safely.
And on the vaccine development front, I mean, the good news, it was good to hear that there's planning prospectively for an anticipated second wave. That makes eminent sense, lessons learned from the last several months.
Sorry for interrupting. This is the same doctor, though, that's called Chicago a hotspot, and our numbers are actually going down.
Well, I mean, Chicago was a hotspot, but it was not a hotspot for as long as Governor Pritzker and Lori Lightfoot were saying it was a hotspot.
Right.
And with the whole cases going up, that is the beginning of a conversation, not the end of the conversation, at least if you want to believe experts in the space, really across the spectrum. I would love to be able to talk to more of Governor Pritzker's and Mayor Lightfoot's experts. Maybe we'll continue to effort them. We did talk to one of his modelers a few weeks back. But just to set some baseline understanding of what we're trying to measure and what we're trying to accomplish. On the vaccine development front, we mentioned this briefly with John Hindraker earlier in the program, but sort of a remarkable statement coming out of Oxford. Oxford is one of the research groups, a research group at Oxford, one of the more promising potential vaccine developers, along with Moderna in this country. The University of Oxford's Jenner Institute and Oxford Vaccine Group began developing a COVID-19 vaccine back in January using a virus taken from chimpanzees. But Professor Adrian Hill, one of the researchers and the institute director, said the number of coronavirus cases in Britain is dropping every day, and they're running into a problem. They may not have enough people to test the potential vaccine on.
Oh, my gosh.
The clinical trials, saying it's a race against the virus disappearing and against time. We said earlier in the year that there was an 80% chance of developing an effective vaccine by September, but at the moment there's a 50% chance that we will get no result at all. We're in the bizarre position of wanting COVID to stay, at least for a little while, because they need the infected on which to test the virus, on who to test the virus. Okay. Trying to follow
Didn't
the
see
logic.
that coming.
Well, but and this also goes to the whole issue of the ethical questions around human challenge trials, providing low doses of the vaccine to infect people that are younger and healthier and thus less susceptible to the virus, so that you can test the vaccine. Maybe that's something that will have to happen for Oxford and maybe in the United States as well. Then there's this. Here we go again, sort of the stop and start, what we understand for a while, and then what's walked back. The U.S. could finally be free of the coronavirus in late September, according to scientists in Singapore at the Singapore University of Technology and Design, using AI, artificial intelligence, to update their charting of the pandemic's life cycle by country. That's what they initially said. And then they took down their country-by-country charts from the website, instead posting a disclaimer that the research they posted was for educational purposes and may contain errors. So everything is,
arbitrary.
Not arbitrary, but to be viewed with some skepticism. This is, it's like the practice of medicine. This is research. This is science as a question that is never fully answered, rather than the scientists and data say, and you have politicians issuing edicts and speaking with the certainty that the actual scientists and researchers they're referencing don't convey. And then lastly, the CDC, this just has to be repeated, revising down its estimated case fatality rate to less than 0.4%, down from 2.5%, some of the early models that drove the lockdown policies, down from 0.8% to 1%. Its overall symptomatic case fatality rate, 0.4%, roughly 4 times the estimated CFR for the seasonal flu. The CDC estimates that the CFR case fatality rate for COVID-19 falls to 0.05% among people younger than 50. That's 1/2 the rate of the seasonal flu. Under 50, 0.05. Rises to 1.3% for people among 65 and older. People in the middle, 50 to 64, CFR 0.2%, twice the seasonal flu. What we know now, CDC's revised down estimates and with more revisions sure to come, consistent with what we've observed about the virus being a serious issue for people older, people with comorbidities, being akin to the seasonal flu, if even that lethal for people that are younger and healthier. And yet the policies we've chosen up until this point.
And the freedoms we quickly gave away.
Right. For more on this, we're pleased to be joined again by our friend Dr. Kevin Pham. He's a MD. He's a contributor to the Daily Signal, former graduate fellow in health policy at the Heritage Foundation. Dr. Pham, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me again.
Why don't we start with the CDC's revisions down and just the continued fight against people like Melinda Gates, who think money buys infectious disease expertise, and the pronouncement that COVID-19 anywhere is COVID-19 everywhere. It just simply isn't based on the data.
I suspect that money really can buy you expertise, and the more money that you spend, the more you have people who are hyper-focused on a problem. So then what you get are people who see infectious diseases like COVID-19 everywhere. And so they get a little bit too much into this, and then they see that that's the problem. I think that's really sort of what undergirds Dr. Fauci's worldview. Because we see him kind of go back and forth. Earlier last week, he said that perhaps it was earlier than that, but he said that if we rush headlong into reopening, then we risk a resurgence in cases, and then that'll really set us back economically. And then later on, he said that if we maintain a lockdown for too long, then we're going to have irreparable damage. And the truth is, both of those things are right. But if you maintain these like heavy mitigation things, you're guaranteed to have irreparable damage. Whereas if you start to reopen the country, then you risk irreparable damage. And between guaranteed ruination and risking ruination, I would rather risk it than be guaranteed it.
Yeah, it seems sensible.
And our mayor here, she said we're not going back to, phase 5, as she calls it, until there's a vaccine. And we might never have a vaccine. They still don't have a vaccine for AIDS, but there's therapeutic drugs that can be used.
Right. Waiting for a vaccine to reopen is highly unrealistic because, as you mentioned, it's not guaranteed to happen. There are a lot of candidates out there right now, and there's a lot of resources being devoted to getting these things through the trials, and that's good. And honestly, I would bet that we will have a vaccine sooner rather than later, but I think fall is a bit too soon. But whatever the case may be, we can't wait until fall in these heavy lockdown strategies. So it's too far out there to maintain the lockdowns, and waiting for a vaccine is really highly unrealistic.
With respect to antiviral treatments in the interim, of course, there was much controversy over the last week as President Trump said he was undergoing a regimen with hydroxychloroquine that has since concluded, so he said. And, the media feasting on this, trying to suggest that the president was putting his life at risk or signaling to others who could put their lives at risk. When in point of fact, HCQ is under an emergency use authorization for COVID, so it's a matter between a doctor and patient, including the President of the United States. And there are clinical trials underway. So doesn't it make sense just to chill the freak out and wait for the clinical trials and let doctors and patients make collaborative decisions?
Right. The only validity to criticizing the president in this case, in the case of his personal use of hydroxychloroquine, that was decided between him and his doctor, and he's surrounded by a whole bunch of other doctors right at this time. The only validity to that controversy is that I would rather not have my president be participating in the clinical trial. But the truth is, it's being tested as a prophylaxis in America's got excuse me. There's two trials right now looking at using this drug as prophylaxis in healthcare workers, and in India right now, their equivalent of the NIH already approved the use of hydroxychloroquine as a prophylaxis. So there's not the science isn't settled. Science is never really settled on anything, but there's no solid fact that this is more dangerous to your health than not. There's a recent Lancet study that showed that people who took it had higher mortality, but that was a retrospective study, and you cannot tell causation from a retrospective study. You can only do that with a prospective study. All the science that we have now suggests that there may be a possibility that it does work. So, the science is really ambivalent about whether it does or does not work. Either can still be the case. What we really don't need right now is using a drug, a potential cure for this disease, as a partisan weapon right now. That's just unhelpful to everybody.
Well, what are some side effects of taking hydroxychloroquine?
The main one that we're concerned about is cardiac complications. The the heart, as you know, is powered by a electrical impulse that travels throughout the entire heart to cause it to beat in rhythm. And the tracing, when you see an EKG, that's called a PQRST interval. Between the Q and the T interval, that's sort of what we're looking at. If that starts to elongate, then that electrical impulse may become disordered, and it may follow the wrong route, and then your heart may enter into an arrhythmia. And that's what we're worried about. If your heart enters an arrhythmia, it could be life-threatening. It depends on what kind of arrhythmia. Some people are managed on it, so other people can go into something that's basically a heart attack. So that's the main concern, and it's very well understood, and it's well managed too. There's no doctor in the world who's going to put their patient on hydroxychloroquine without considering the heart health of the patient. So that being the case, the president is almost at not zero, obviously not zero, but at very low risk because he's got several doctors looking at him right now.
There was a study that's going to be published in the journal Cell, reported on by John Solomon. Researchers from California, New York, North Carolina discovered certain types of cells in blood samples taken from donors between the period 2015 to 2018, well before COVID-19, were reactive against the COVID-19 virus. In other words, those blood samples were at least partially immune from the coronavirus, even though they had never been exposed to it. From the paper, CD4 plus T cell responses were detected in 40 to 60% of unexposed individuals. This may be reflective of some degree of cross-reactive pre-existing immunity to COVID-19 in some, but not all individuals. And the point being, and this is, a supposition, it's a research paper, soon to be published in a medical journal, but that you may have a significant percentage, if not a majority of the population, having some degree of pre-existing immunity to COVID-19 if what this research paper suggests is true.
Right, and that could show that there's some cross immunity to possibly other coronaviruses, because one of the cold viruses is a coronavirus, and just in everyday there are many coronaviruses out there, so there may be some cross immunity, which would be a good thing if we have that. And also suggests to me that a vaccine might be more effective too, because there's a lot of stability in whatever the antigen that is being targeted by the immune system. So that speaks to a couple of different things, but essentially it says that the coronavirus is a relatively stable virus, and that gives us several new targets that we can start attacking to really stop this thing moving forward.
What's your sense of the prospect of a second wave in the fall and in the winter, and the strength, or what we suspect about the strength of that second wave, if it's likely to happen?
I would suspect that the strength of it will be greatly diminished. The public health messaging has been very prominent. And I think people will really change their behaviors, not just as a result of what the government tells them to do, but just as an assessment of their own risk in their own daily life. I think people will change the way they behave and act. But I do think there will be a second wave, just because the colder, drier temperatures in fall are going to make the virus particles more stable in air and on surfaces. So there will be a greater chance for infection. And when you're looking at population statistics for infections, and it's basically, again, percentages, as the likelihood that this thing is more viable for longer, then more people will get infected by it. So that's just kind of how it plays out. I think that we'll be ready for it. We've been spending a lot of time in the industry, or time and resources in the industry to really ramp up our resources and be able to handle a second wave. So I think it will come. I don't think it will be that strong, and I think we'll be ready for it.
He is Dr. Kevin Pham. He's an MD. He's contributor to Daily Signal, former graduate fellow in health policy at the Heritage Foundation as well. Dr. Pham, thanks as always for joining us. Appreciate it.
Always a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
It's news, opinion, insight. This is Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.
Signature Bank is Chicago's fastest growing independently owned business bank. It's a bank where relationships still matter. Signature Bank knows your name and your story. I'm Dan Proft, and I know this because Signature Bank is my business bank.
I'm Frank Vance.